Yeah, so 16 standards. My name's Charlie. I'm co-founder of a company called Decent. We enable one-click transactions using any token between chains. So we often embed into the front end of applications or work directly with wallets. So enable users to spend whatever token they have in their wallet directly within the application with which they're trying to interact. So a lot of what Vishnu just talked about, we think about like how does that actually surface directly to the end user and like a front-end developer. And that's a lot of the context for this conversation. Anytime to start talking standards, the propensity for an eye roll, so set the tone there and say why this is a little bit different. Cool. So when we think about fragmentation, like why does this problem exist? Why do we need chain abstraction? Like see it really being driven by kind of three aspects. The first is more chains. So as applications start deploying to all their own networks, like how do users go and transact there? I might hold all my assets on one of these liquidity hub type chains, but I might be actually doing all my transactions on a Zora or a Blackbird or one of these longer tail spoke chains. So what happens there? The second would be like more tokens. So, a huge property of these new networks is they, by and large, like a lot of them have their own gas tokens. So when you think about like why the Orbit stack actually like surged pretty well versus the OP stack, like a big reason why was because like teams could have their own gas token. And so you see like Zai and now like ApeChain, among many others, using that to drive adoption for their token. So that further, fragments the liquidity that a bridge or solver might have to provide to fill those transactions. And then the third would just be like the bridging and like solving landscape is changing a lot. So you've moved from like liquidity pool-based bridges where it's a lot of like in-protocol liquidity, and that's like the primary mechanism filling these cross-chain transactions. So consider like a Stargate. And then you move to like a slightly more modern standard, which would be like, across in these intense protocols, and really what the last talk was all about in large part. And those are great, and you get, significantly faster transactions, which is obviously great for our focus area. And now you're starting to see like even more liquidity sources pop up. So one would be like asset issuers. So you think about like, the OFT standard, like an EtherFi, or you think about Renzo and Easy ETH with Hyperlane. Like they're actually saying, we don't really need any of you guys. Like this is actually a piece of the stack that we want to own. So when it comes to like cross-chain routing, like you now are just introducing like an exponentially increasing number of routes through like tokens, chains, and then like bridgeable tokens, among other sources. So a lot of you guys are probably familiar with like the cake framework. This is like a little bit of our visualization here. So for applications, like what they really want is basically Bungie, to show our gracious host today. They want like an easy set of APIs that gives them some guarantee that they're getting the best quote for a transaction. I think like, Wi-Fi fits in there. And then you're sort of seeing like new entrants as well, being like Crossman and Third Web. So these are tool sets that application devs are building with directly. And they're making their own decisions about like how they're going to surface cross-chain liquidity. So in Crossman's case, they actually decided they're going to be their own bridge. Further adding more, sets of viable solvers to the intermediate layer, bridge indexes. I won't go through this whole slate, but general idea is like it's a mess and there's a lot of routing happening at each level independently. So this is like roughly what aggregation looks like today. You have some protocol, it is handling, registering like bridges indexes through these adapter contracts to provide like some common interface by which you can like route through all these discrete liquidity sources. And you're doing some calculations around the best route, and like Bungie wins because they are able to provide like the fastest, cheapest routes to users. It's really easy to implement, and like that's more or less the story there. That like model of aggregation is shaping up to just be really hard to keep up with where the space is going. Namely, like if we actually end up in a future of 10,000 chains with 5,000 different gas tokens, that's just going to be really, really hard to do. And I think a great example of this is actually like back to the Renzo and Hyperlane case study. So I think there's some folks from Hyperlane in here today, but like Renzo basically decides like, hey, like we want our token to have like liquidity across multiple networks. We're gonna use Hyperlane as like to deploy this interchain token. It ends up becoming like the primary fast bridge for Blast for like several weeks or months. And this token alone did like $2.5 billion of volume just in bridging in the last, I don't know, like 3 months or whatever. So, like this is like one example of bridging really moving into these long tail areas where it just gets really hard to aggregate. So what do we do? Okay, brief interlude. So like, why is aggregation become hard? Like, have these persistent deployment of new rollups, intense asset issuers. So kind of going through a lot of what I've talked about so far. But maybe the final point to bring up is like further like reinforcing some of these token-centric bridging models we see are like chain frameworks are starting to get really, really good at interop themselves. So, Arbitrum's rolling out fast withdrawals, like OP Stack has pushed Kona, which sets the framework for ZK proofs. You have Polygon's Ag Layer, Elastic Chains. You have super builders fucking in the background somewhere. And all of a sudden, like all these chains, there's this promise of intra-network interoperability. So how do you aggregate that and surface that to an application? So like what we've been thinking about a lot is, what does like some interchain execution client look like? So when you think about like, how does an execution client work for a typical Ethereum chain? Like there's some, set of execution APIs that the Ethereum Foundation proposed. They return you into a JSON RPC spec. Basically every node hosting every chain provides the same set of calls that are available to, any infra or application developer deployed to that chain. So like, what does that look like for the quote unquote interchain? And some of the qualifications would be like, you want to fill all these like really novel and completely unrelated mechanisms to provide good quotes across the networks. Something like the protocol that like a Bungie or Leaf5 uses today, more or less like does a pretty good job of that in a lot of ways. I think the adapters need to update in some ways, but like generally all right. The real question is like, what do the APIs look like? Because, so I'm sure the Bungie team can tell you like, it's not easy to like scale to a new network or integrate a new bridge. So this is where the 16th standard comes in, where I want everyone's feedback. But the base premise is, aggregation protocols today, they like operate on the premise that like a single company is going to go like out and aggregate a new bridge. But like, what if you flip that and it's like the APIs are built in a way that it just expects like new interop protocols to come to them. So if Renzo wants to bridge between like ETH and Blast, they can actually use like the same set of calls. All I have to do is specify like Hyperlane at address or something like that. I think like to extend the comp, like, you think about like a typical execution client stack today, it looks like something like this. So you have like the chain, RPC, nodes, yeah, and then like VMs. So some like easy front end library for developers to interact with these underlying execution functions. So the base premise is like, well, bridges are doing like a lot of the role, like they're the ones like actually settling these cross-chain transactions. I've put Decent's logo in there for this like new area of this new like API structure proposing here. And then like what happens to like a traditional aggregator? Well, they can still be like extremely efficient in providing the software that a front-end developer wants to use to call these underlying methods. They might still have like all their own proprietary routes and like calculations, and that might all be like super valuable. So you kind of compare that to like the role of an Alchemy or Infura for the interchain. And then like you still probably want like, I mean, ideally like there'd be a VM extension for this. So yeah. And I think like what this really unlocks is like this notion of implicit aggregation. So as you see like, all of this liquidity and applications like move to the edge, like I want liquidity just where I need it for my application. I want to do some of this, but not all of it. Like you can basically just fill in the parts of the call data that you need when you need it. So take the example of Crossmint, like they might do all their own bridging, but actually say like, we're just going to quote like 0x's API for swaps on every network. And everything we do is going to be minting an NFT. And like, I need to be building call data in real time for all of that. This is what that would unlock. So why this is like, yeah, it's a standard, but like maybe it's a standard we would actually want is like, well, you can kind of just build this as a nice product. It doesn't really like infringe upon like the individual competencies of any stakeholder in this stack, so much as it improves like the distribution that they're all able to have, which is ultimately the role of an aggregator. So why like might people want this, and how are we doing on time?
Time like
1-2 minutes. Okay, so maybe the ones that like pull out of here are like, I think Vishnu mentioned this as well. Like people don't really send messages; they really want like execution of some action. So that one's easy. Aggregators kind of made that comp, but I think it's largely around like, hey, like you can just support any new network now and still like have your own advantages where you want them. Intent-based bridges. I think it's like this notion of last mile liquidity that will start to get talked about a lot. So, I can't actually hold like Brett on base, but I can definitely hold ETH and like do swaps pretty efficiently and execute those transactions in real time. DEX and DEX aggregators, general thought there is like these lines are really going to blur a lot as transactions extend across chains. And then RAS providers, like, they're always looking for reasons to deploy more rollups. Instant ability to transact on that network, that's a big reason for some, that takes out a big reason that might dissuade somebody from deploying one. And they would also be the ones like deploying endpoints to propagate this protocol as well, which they're doing, which is cool. Cool, so this is like the last bit here. And I think like it speaks like this notion of like liquidity is just commoditizing. So, for a long time, like someone like Across, they like amazing product and like they're still doing unbelievably well. But like a lot of their like value prop is like we actually have liquidity in all these sources. Like we have this relationships with the fillers and the like ability to like have like a higher capacity for volume because of that. You see someone like even Across in Uniswap, they're deploying their own ERC 7683 or something. This would let like any routing protocol tap into like the same set of fillers. So like what is Across betting on? They're basically betting on the fact that they can run a really efficient OFA, probably this would be my conjecture, that like differentiates on like how a user, how an application is going to get the best quote from like one of these fillers that would otherwise ultimately be shared. And I think that like as we move into this next wave of chain abstraction, a lot of the questions are going to be around the app layer and just like how do you guarantee and differentiating on like where is your order flow coming from? How are you actually attributing orders, and like what are the possible endpoints for your fills? So that is that's my talk.